Sometimes the truth doesn't speak in words. It waits for someone loyal enough to reveal it. The hallway stretched long and silent, each step echoing like a slow-ticking clock as Daniel Hayes walked forward, his boots brushing against the cold concrete floor, the air carrying that faint metallic chill that settles in places where time seems to hold its breath. And yet his face remained still, not hardened, not broken, just quiet, like a man who had already made peace with something the world did not understand. And when they asked for his final request, he didn't hesitate, didn't look back, didn't even blink. He simply said, "Bring Rex." The room shifted at those words, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a ripple beneath still water, because Rex was not just any dog. He was a trained canine, a German shepherd who had once stood beside Daniel in places where the ground itself could not be trusted, where a single vibration could mean the difference between life and loss. A dog who could hear what others ignored, sense what others dismissed, and remember what others tried to bury. And, as the heavy door at the end of the chamber slowly opened, a draft of cold air slipped inside, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and old steel. And then Rex stepped in, his paws landing softly against the floor, his ears upright, his amber eyes scanning not with excitement, not with relief, but with something far deeper, something older, and Daniel's breath caught. Just for a moment, not because he feared what was coming, but because something felt different, because Rex didn't run to him, didn't wag his tail, didn't even move closer. Instead, he stopped halfway across the room, muscles still, gaze fixed, and then, slowly, deliberately, his head turned, not toward Daniel, but toward the far corner where a single officer stood, silent, watching, and the air changed, thickened, as if the walls themselves were listening, and a low sound began to rise from Rex's chest. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, controlled, the kind of sound he used only when something was wrong. Something hidden, something waiting to be found, and Daniel felt it then, that familiar tension, the same one he used to feel overseas when everything looked calm but nothing truly was, and his voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. That's not right. Because Rex never made mistakes, not in the field, not in training, not ever. And now, here in this room where everything was supposed to be certain, Rex stood unmoving, eyes locked, as if he had just found something the rest of them could not yet see, and somewhere deep beneath the silence, the truth began to stir, quiet, but alive. The sound lingered longer than it should have, that low, controlled rumble rising from Rex's chest, not loud enough to alarm the room, but precise enough to unsettle it, like a signal carried through air too still to ignore, and Daniel did not move, not because he was frozen, but because he had learned long ago that the smallest shifts often revealed the biggest truths, and Rex was not reacting to fear. He was responding to something specific, something real, and the dog's posture made that clear, his weight slightly forward, ears locked in a sharp angle, eyes fixed without wavering, as if he had already confirmed what the rest of them had yet to question. And then came the first step, slow, deliberate. Rex moved not toward Daniel, but across the room, each paw landing with quiet certainty, nails brushing faintly against the polished floor, a soft clicking that echoed just enough to draw every gaze toward him. And the officer in the corner shifted, just slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by Daniel, because he had spent years watching men who carried things they did not want seen, and that kind of movement, that subtle tightening of the shoulders, that breath held just a second too long, it was familiar, and Rex stopped a few feet away from him, head tilted, nostrils flaring as if tracing something invisible in the air, something left behind long before this moment. And then it happened, 3 short barks, sharp, measured, spaced evenly apart, the exact pattern Daniel remembered from another time, another place, when Rex had signaled the presence of something buried beneath the surface, something dangerous not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. And Daniel's voice came low, steady. That is his signal. And a few heads turned, confusion passing between them like a quiet ripple, because to them, it was just a dog, just noise, but to Daniel, it was language, it was memory, it was proof, and Rex did not stop. He lowered his head slightly, eyes never leaving the officer, and let out another controlled growl, not aggressive, not uncontrolled, but certain, and the air in the room shifted again, heavier now like. Something unseen had stepped closer, and Daniel felt it in his chest, that same instinct that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant loss, and he took a slow breath, his eyes following Rex's line of sight, locking onto the man in the corner, who now stood a little too still, hands at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if unsure where to rest. And Daniel spoke again, softer this time, but with a weight that carried across the silence. "He does not forget a scent, and no one," answered, but no one looked away either, because something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And in that quiet space between doubt and realization, the truth began to rise, not forced, not shouted, but revealed one breath at a time. No one spoke, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to confirm what no one dared to say out loud. And Rex remained exactly where he stood, unmoving, unwavering, his gaze fixed with a certainty that could not be trained into existence, only lived, only remembered. And Daniel felt that recognition settled deep in his chest, not as hope, but as something steadier, something grounded in the kind of truth that does not rush, does not panic. It simply waits to be seen. And across the room, the officer shifted again, this time more noticeably, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door as if measuring distance, as if calculating something no one else could see. And Daniel noticed that too, because men who carry the past often reveal it in small fractures, in the way their stillness begins to crack under quiet pressure. And Rex took one more step forward, slow, deliberate, until the space between them felt charged, and then he stopped, lowering his head slightly, nostrils flaring once more as if drawing in the final confirmation. And what followed was not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Rex sat down, firm, alert, and let out a single, low exhale, the exact posture he used when identifying something hidden beneath layers. Something buried, but undeniable. And Daniel's voice came again, calm but sharper now. "Check him." And that was when the room truly changed, because the request was simple, but the weight behind it was not. And for a moment, no one moved, not out of refusal, but out of hesitation, because something invisible had just become visible enough to question. And then one of the supervisors stepped forward, his expression careful, measured, as if stepping into water he could not yet gauge, and he approached the officer, speaking quietly, asking routine questions that suddenly did not feel routine at all. And the officer responded, but his voice carried a slight strain, a tightness that did not belong in a room built on control. And Rex's ears flicked once, tracking every shift in tone, every subtle change in breath. And Daniel watched it all with the still patience of someone who had learned that truth often arrives disguised as doubt. And then came the moment, small but irreversible, when the supervisor paused, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if something had not aligned, and he turned, looking back at Rex, then at Daniel. And for the first time, uncertainty crossed his face, not fear, not panic, but recognition, the kind that arrives when a piece of a puzzle suddenly fits where it should not. And the room, once so certain, so structured, now felt different, softer at the edges, as if the lines that defined it were beginning to blur. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in understanding, because whatever Rex had found, whatever truth had lingered unseen until now, it was no longer alone. It had been seen, and once seen, it could not be ignored, not anymore. The supervisor's hesitation lingered just long enough to shift the balance of the room, and in that fragile space between certainty and doubt, something unspoken began to take shape, not as accusation, but as awareness. And Rex remained seated, steady, composed, his breathing slow and controlled, as if he had already completed his task and was now waiting for the humans to catch up. And Daniel watched him closely, recognizing that posture, that quiet insistence, the same one Rex used when he had located something buried beneath layers of earth or debris, something that could not be seen but could not be denied. and the supervisor turned slightly, signaling to another officer near the door, his voice low, careful, requesting a brief pause, a simple delay. Nothing more, yet the effect was immediate. The rhythm of the room broke, the invisible clock that had been ticking toward a single outcome suddenly faltered, and the officer in the corner shifted again, this time taking a small step back, subtle but unmistakable, as if distance could soften whatever was now pressing against him. And Rex's ears twitched at that movement, his gaze sharpening, locking even tighter, and Daniel felt a memory rise, uninvited but clear, a moment years ago when Rex had done the same thing in a crowded field overseas, when everyone else saw nothing but dust and rubble. But Rex had stopped, sat down, and refused to move, and hours later they had uncovered what no one else believed was there. And Daniel's voice carried that memory now, steady, grounded. He only sits like that when he knows. And the words settled into the room with quiet weight, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and the supervisor nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, before stepping closer to the officer, his questions becoming more precise, more deliberate, and the officer answered, but the edges of his voice began to fray, small inconsistencies slipping through, barely noticeable on their own, but together forming something uneven, something that did not align, and Rex exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm that contrasted sharply with the growing tension around him, and Daniel realized then that Rex was not reacting anymore. He was confirming, holding his position as if anchoring the truth in place, refusing to let it drift back into silence. And the supervisor's expression changed, just slightly, the kind of change that comes when doubt becomes direction. And he stepped back, glancing toward the control panel, then back at Daniel. And for the first time, there was no certainty in his eyes, only a question that had finally found its voice, and Daniel met that look without fear, without urgency, simply present, as if he had been waiting for this moment not with hope, but with quiet faith, and the room, once defined by its finality, now felt suspended, held between what was believed and what was beginning to be revealed, and somewhere within that stillness, the truth, long buried and nearly forgotten, had taken its first undeniable breath. The room no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt like something had been interrupted mid-sentence, as if the story everyone thought they understood had paused just long enough to reveal a missing piece, and the supervisor's hand hovered near the panel, not pressing, not moving forward, just waiting, and that hesitation alone carried more weight than any command, and Rex stayed exactly where he was, grounded, certain, his presence now less like a reaction and more like an anchor holding the moment in place, refusing to let it slip back into routine. And Daniel stood quietly, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes steady, not searching for answers anymore, but watching them arrive, slowly, one detail at a time. And across the room, the officer's composure began to thin, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for those who knew what to look for. A shift in posture, a breath taken too quickly, a glance that lingered too long on the exit, and the supervisor noticed, not all at once, but in fragments that began to connect, small inconsistencies forming a pattern that did not belong. And he stepped closer, his voice calm, asking questions that sounded ordinary, but carried a different weight now. Questions about timelines, about presence, about things that had once been accepted without question, and the officer responded, but each answer seemed to arrive, just a fraction. Too late, as if it had to be assembled before it could be spoken, and Rex's ears flicked again, tracking every change, every hesitation, and Daniel remembered the way Rex used to do that in the field, not reacting to noise, but to intention, to the subtle signals that lived beneath words. And he spoke softly, almost to himself. He is following something, and the words settled into the space between them. And for the first time, no one dismissed them, because something had already shifted too, far to return to what it was. And the supervisor exhaled slowly, his gaze moving from the officer to Rex, then back again. And in that silent exchange, a decision formed, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable, and he stepped back, signaling quietly to the others, his voice low but clear enough to carry, requesting a formal review, a pause that was no longer optional. And the room responded, not with resistance, but with a quiet compliance that came from understanding something had changed. Beyond control, and the invisible line that had once pointed in only one direction now curved, uncertain, open, and the officer stood still, no longer shifting, no longer speaking, as if the weight of being seen had finally settled in, and Rex slowly rose from his seated position, his posture easing just slightly, not in relief, but in completion, as if the part he was meant to play had been fulfilled, and Daniel watched him, a faint breath leaving his chest, not quite a sigh, not quite a release, just a recognition that something long buried had finally surfaced. And though nothing had been declared, nothing confirmed, the truth had already begun to move through the room, quiet and steady, like a current no one could stop once it had found its way to the light. Time did not move forward. It unfolded slowly, carefully, as if the moment itself needed space to breathe, and the decision to pause had already changed everything, even before anyone said it out loud. And the supervisor stepped aside, speaking in low tones to the control room beyond the glass. His voice steady, but different now. No longer procedural, no longer automatic, but deliberate, shaped by the quiet realization that something had slipped through unnoticed for far too long, and Daniel remained where he stood, hands still, shoulders at ease, his gaze following Rex, who now stood calmly at his side, no longer fixed on the officer, but no longer uncertain either, as if the purpose that had guided him into the room had already been fulfilled, and the air, once sharp and final, softened just enough to feel human again, carrying faint sounds that had been drowned out before. The hum of ventilation, the distant click of a door, the subtle rhythm of breath returning to the space and across the room. The officer no longer looked toward the exit. He looked downward, his posture no longer guarded, but heavy, as if something invisible had settled onto his shoulders, something that could not be shifted or explained away. And the supervisor returned, his expression composed, but no longer neutral. And he spoke clearly this time, not loudly, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, requesting a full review of the original case, citing new behavioral indicators, citing the K-9 response, citing the inconsistencies that had begun to surface, and though the words were measured, their meaning carried weight because they opened a door that had been closed for years, and Daniel heard them without reaction, not because they did not matter, but because he had learned not to trust moments that arrived too suddenly. And yet there was something different in this one, something steady, something that did not feel like hope, but like alignment, and Rex sat down beside him again, closer this time, his body relaxed, his head slightly lowered, not in submission, but in quiet companionship, and Daniel glanced down, his hand resting briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the warmth there, the steady pulse that had never failed him, not once, and for a moment, neither of them moved. And that stillness carried more truth than anything spoken in the room, and beyond them, the process that had once moved in a single direction now slowed, then shifted, then stopped entirely, not with noise, not with resistance, but with the simple recognition that something had been missed, and now it could not be unseen. And the supervisor turned once more toward Daniel, his voice softer now, not official, not distant, but human, explaining that everything would be reviewed, that nothing would proceed until answers were found. And Daniel listened, his expression unchanged, but his breath slightly deeper, as if something long held had finally loosened, and the room, once defined by its finality, now held something else entirely. Not certainty, not resolution, but possibility, quiet and fragile, yet undeniable, like the first light before sunrise, when the world has not changed yet, but you know it will. The shift did not come with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly like a tide, turning beneath still water, and though nothing in the room had physically changed, everything within it felt different, as if the weight that once pushed everything forward had lifted just enough to allow something else to surface, something slower, something patient, and Daniel felt it in the way the air moved again, no longer pressing, no longer closing in, but opening, creating space where there had been none before, and Rex stayed close, his presence steady, grounded, no longer searching, no longer signaling, but simply there, as if the work he had come to do had already taken root beyond what anyone could see. And the supervisor stood near the center now, speaking into a small radio, his words measured, requesting records, requesting timelines, requesting details that had once been considered settled. And each request carried a quiet implication, that the past was no longer fixed, that something within it had shifted, and across the room, the officer remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer controlled, no longer composed, but heavy, uncertain, as if the space around him had grown too narrow to hold what was now pressing against it. And Daniel watched without judgment, without anger, only with a calm awareness that truth did not need force once it began to reveal itself. It only needed time, and time, for the first time in a long while, was no longer running out. And somewhere beyond the walls, systems that had once moved without question were beginning to slow, to re-examine, to reopen what had been closed. And though Daniel could not see it, he could feel it, like a distant echo returning after years of silence. And Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears turning toward a sound too faint for anyone else to notice, something beyond the room, beyond the moment. And Daniel followed that instinct, not with his eyes, but with a quiet understanding that whatever had begun here was no longer contained within these walls. It was moving outward, expanding, touching things that had been left untouched for too long. And the supervisor lowered his radio, his expression no longer guarded, but focused, as if the direction ahead had finally become clear, and he turned once more toward Daniel, not as an official addressing a process, but as a man recognizing another man, standing at the center of something that should have been seen long ago. And Daniel met that look without expectation, without demand, simply present, as if he had always known that if the truth ever came, it would not arrive with noise or force, but with something quieter, something steady, something that could not be ignored once it had been felt. And in that quiet exchange, something passed between them. Not words, not promises, but acknowledgement, and Rex shifted slightly, leaning closer to Daniel's side, his body warm, his breath even, and for the first time since stepping into the room, Daniel allowed his hand to rest there longer, not as reassurance, but as recognition. Because whatever had brought them here, whatever had guided Rex to that single point of stillness, had already begun to change everything. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that the path ahead no longer led to an ending, but to something else entirely, something still unfolding, still unseen, but no longer out of reach. The hours that followed did not pass in a way Daniel remembered time passing before. They did not rush or drag. They unfolded, piece by piece, like something carefully being uncovered after years beneath the surface. And though he remained in the same place, the same room, everything beyond it had begun to move, quietly but with purpose, and Rex stayed close, never straying more than a few inches from Daniel's side, his presence steady, his breathing calm, as if whatever tension had once filled him had now been replaced with a quiet certainty that the path ahead no longer needed his warning, only his watch. And the supervisor returned more than once, each time carrying less doubt and more direction, his steps firmer, his voice clearer, and though he spoke in measured tones, the weight of what he was learning began to show in the way he paused before each sentence, in the way his eyes held just a fraction longer on Daniel, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the story that had been written about him years ago. And outside the room, records were being reopened, timelines re-examined, details revisited that had once been accepted without question, and now, under a different light, no longer aligned the way they should. And Daniel listened when he was spoken to, answered when asked, but otherwise remained still, not withdrawn, not detached, but present in a way that did not demand attention. Because something within him understood that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to find its own way forward. And Rex shifted slightly, his ears turning once more, not in alert, but in quiet awareness, as if tracking something far beyond the room. something unfolding step by step, and Daniel followed that instinct without thinking, his gaze softening, his breath steady, and for the first time in years, the silence around him did not feel heavy. It felt open, like a space where something new could exist. And when the supervisor returned again, there was no hesitation left in his expression, only clarity. And he spoke plainly this time, explaining that inconsistencies had been confirmed, that timelines did not match, that evidence once considered certain had begun to unravel under closer review. And though the words were careful, they carried a quiet finality of their own, not of ending, but of change. And Daniel nodded once, not in relief, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, because the shift had already been felt long before it was spoken, and Rex leaned gently against his leg. A subtle gesture, almost unnoticed, but filled with something deeper than comfort, something that spoke of completion, of loyalty fulfilled not through action, but through presence. And beyond the walls, the system that had once moved in a single direction was now turning, slowly but undeniably, towards something it had nearly overlooked. And though the outcome had not yet been declared, the path ahead was no longer hidden. It was visible now, unfolding in quiet steps, guided not by force but by something far simpler and far more powerful. The refusal of one loyal soul to ignore what it knew was true. It was not the clarity of the words that made the room shift, but the silence that followed them, the kind of silence that fills spaces with more meaning than any spoken sentence could. And Daniel stood still, feeling the weight of the moment, not as a burden, but as something earned, something that could no longer be avoided. And Rex, ever the quiet sentinel, remained close, his presence a steady anchor in a room where everything had begun to move in ways no one had expected. The supervisor, once distant, now stood beside him, his expression no longer cautious but thoughtful, as if he had been seeing this moment in pieces and was now putting them together, understanding something deeper than facts or figures. And the words had already been spoken, the request for a full review, the acknowledgement that the case was no longer what it had seemed, and the room hummed with the knowledge that a change had taken place. But it wasn't just a change in what was happening. It was a shift in how things were being seen. And for Daniel, the room had become less a place of waiting and more a place of becoming, as if everything that had once been locked in place had started to breathe again. Across from him, the officer stood, his eyes not meeting anyone's now, but staring straight ahead, the stillness of his posture no longer offering the reassurance of control, but the weight of something much heavier, something that had been hidden under layers of protocol and uniform. And Daniel could feel it in the air between them, the quiet recognition of something that could no longer be undone. And yet, as he watched Rex's calm posture, his slow, even breathing, Daniel knew that the truth, the real truth, was not about the revelation itself, but about how it had arrived. Quiet, steady, unforced, and undeniable. It had not come with noise or confrontation, but with the simple, patient insistence of a dog who had learned to read the world in a way humans had forgotten. And Rex's gaze met his for just a moment, steady, unwavering, and for the briefest of moments, Daniel saw not a dog, but a partner, a reflection of everything that had led him to this point. And in that silence, in that small exchange of understanding, the future began to open up, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as something slow, steady, and inevitable, like the turning of a wheel that could not be stopped once it had started. The supervisor's voice cut through the stillness again, softer this time, more certain. And as he spoke of next steps, of reaching out to re-examine the details, to find the answers that had been buried too long, Daniel didn't need to hear the specifics. He already knew that the path ahead had changed, not because of the decisions being made now, but because of the one who had been watching all along, guiding them to this point without ever needing to speak. And Rex, once again, simply stood by, his side, loyal, steadfast, the unspoken force that had brought them here. And Daniel felt a calm settle within him. Not relief, not joy, but a quiet certainty that the next chapter had already begun, not in the words spoken, but in the moment that had shifted everything. And now, with the truth in motion, All he had to do was let it unfold, quietly, steadily, without force, just as Rex had done all along.